Hello, welcome back to 123 Java. This video is going to be about conditionals and how they're used specifically in the Java programming language. But just so you know, these ideas are pretty standard, I would say, across all programming languages. So let's get started. You've probably seen something that looks like this before. If, some condition, and then else, something else. Okay, so this pretty much, if you were to phrase it in English, it's pretty straightforward. I think it'll mean what you expect it to mean, is what I'm trying to say. So when we read a statement like this is a conditional. We're saying if a certain condition is true, then something happens in here. And if that condition is not true, every other possible condition that isn't this one applies to this block statement here, the else statement. And something else will happen in here. So this will only get executed, this code that you write inside of these brackets will only get executed if and only if whatever condition you've written in here is true. And if it's not, every other possibility will apply to this block here. So let's go ahead and demonstrate how that would work. There's so many different ways I could demonstrate this, but since the last lesson was about loops, let's try and build on what we've learned. And so I'm going to go ahead and use a conditional inside of a loop so that we can start building on these things. So we've talked about a for loop. And remember our three components for a for loop. You start with not always an integer, but let's do that here. Start with an integer to make it simple. Let's start it at 0 because that's pretty standard. Let's say the loop is going to go till 10. So while the 10. And let's say each time we're going to increment I by 1. Remember, I plus plus just means the same thing as I equals I plus 1. It's just easier syntax. So here's our loop. Now let's do something with a conditional here. So let's say if so remember what we're doing in this loop is each time this loop loops, essentially, we're going to be incrementing I by 1 until I reaches 10. So it's basically going to start at 0, we're going to go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 10. So let's just think about these numbers that we'll be dealing with here. We have from 0 to 10. And let's think about just any random way that certain numbers could be different from each other. And just for the sake of easiness, let's just say like what we're going to be dealing with here is numbers. Let's just check to see if a number is greater than, 5. So let's say if I is greater than 5, do something else, do something else. So since our loop is going to be going from 0 to 10, let's make something happen when the number is greater than 5. So let's print so that we can easily see what's going on. Print. Let's give it the number, which will be I. We want to be we don't want to hard code it in there since this is going to be looping and I will constantly be being updated. So let's say I plus the string is greater than 5. So we've written this condition. So this will only happen when I is greater than 5. Now what do we want to put in the else? Well, we said this else is going to happen only when this is not true, when I is greater than 5 is not true. So therefore, something that would make sense to print out here would be the number again, I. And then you could say is not greater than 5. So let's run this and let's see what we get. See, there we go. So we have, as you can see, it's iterated from 0 all the way to, well, I guess it didn't include 10 because we didn't include this equal sign in here, but it iterated from 0 to 9, and for each number, it will show you exactly that 0 is not greater than 5, neither is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 is not either because it's equal to 5, so not greater than. But then once you pass that 5, these numbers are all greater than 5. So that's just one way you can use a conditional in a loop. This is obviously just printing out some very obvious things, but this can be a lot more helpful later on if you want to. I mean, this statement in here could be anything. You could just say you want to only affect even numbers. You could say if I is even, which you would use the modulo operator here. And what modulo does is it'll divide the number by 2 and then check the remainder. And if the remainder is 0, that means it's divisible by 2, therefore the number is even. So that's just like one other example. You can really put anything in here that you want. So like say you want to loop through all these numbers and you want to only affect I when it has certain values, like not the whole range. So that could be just even numbers, just numbers greater than 5, or really like anything you want. And that's why this if statement is so helpful. Now, sometimes you can definitely use if statements if you want without an else. That's definitely possible. So before I explain, let's just run this and see what will happen without that else in there. So there we go. It's just going to print, it's only going to affect the system when this condition is met. And if there's no else in there, then it's essentially saying do nothing. So if you're writing out if blah, 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 do this, and you haven't put an else in there, it's essentially saying this if on its own is essentially synonymous to saying if blah, 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 else. And then this is an empty bracket since you haven't told it to do anything for the else condition. So this could just be do nothing. And that's a comment right here. This isn't a real command or anything. So as you can see, same thing. So you don't always have to have an else in there. If you only want to deal with like that one side of those conditionals, then you don't need the else. Okay, so here is the last important step for dealing with conditionals. So you've seen if, you've seen else, and there's this other thing called else if. So else if is useful when you have more than one possible condition. So in our previous example with if I greater than 5, blah, 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 else, blah, 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 really there's only 2 possible conditions that you've given it. I can either be greater than 5 or I can either be not greater than 5. So there's just 2 things that it can hit. But what if you wanted to deal with, let's say, individual numbers? Like say you wanted to deal with 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you wanted different things to happen for each one of those numbers. Just writing if else isn't going to be enough because there's only 2 conditions that can be reached, whereas you might want like 5 or 6 of them or even more. So here's an example of how that would work. So you start with your if. You're always going to start with if. So let's say we want to deal with all the numbers between 0 and 5. We could do 10, but I don't think we need to write all that out. Like, you'll get the point. If I equals 0, something happens. Now you'll notice I've put this double equals here. I'm going to touch on that in the next video, but essentially if you just give it a singular equals here, you're going to get a compiler error. And that's because, just as we talked about in the video about variables, the single equals just means that it's not a true equality. You're just putting a value into a box. It's just a very temporary equals. You're saying, for now, put the value 0 into that box, and that value is going to be updated, kind of like we do up here. This starts at 0, but then it always changes. So this is like a definite equals here. So it might not make sense for now, but just know that if you're writing an if statement, you're always going to need this double equals, or else it's not going to compile, because this is a true Boolean statement, whereas this is not. So there we go. So let's say if I equals 0, I don't know, we could print print it's 0. Okay. Now, okay, so we've handled the case for 0. Now say we also want to handle the case for 1 and 2 and 3. So if we just put else here, that's going to catch all those other situations, because you've given it, you're checking to see if I is 0, and if you just write else here, else is going to apply to any other number, and then that command, whatever you give it, is going to apply to 2, 3, 4, whatever. But say you want individual commands for all those numbers. That's when else if comes in. So else if is just a way to be able to handle multiple mutually exclusive conditions. So else if I equals 1, let's say. Then we can go ahead and print it's 1. Now say you want to do the same thing, a similar thing for I equals 2. Same thing, you're also going to need that else if, because otherwise it'll just be a catch-all situation and it won't give it those individual commands. Okay, so now, we've handled 0, 1, and 2. And typically you want to end, if you're doing a block like this with if, then else if, then else if, you still do want to end with else in most cases. So, for example, an example like this, so we've handled 0, 1, 2. This is going to do something for every time I is 0, 1, or 2. But let's say we want something else to happen for all the other numbers. That's where this else comes in, this last else. So then we could say it is not 0, 1, or 2. Okay, so there we go. That's this is the way to use else if. And again, these should all be mutually exclusive statements. So I can never be 0 and 1 at the same time if you're using this if and this else if. So now let's see what happens. So there we go. So it started at 0. It's telling me it's 0. It's telling me it's 1. Oh, whoops, I don't think I changed this to be 2. Sorry. It's 2. So there it is. 0, 1, 2. And then once it's past 2, for every single other one of these numbers, because this is just a very broad else, it's telling me this. It can't be either of those because all these conditions are mutually exclusive. They can't happen at the same time. Okay, so that's a very basic overview of conditional statements. Just remember about if, else, and if you have multiple conditionals that are mutually exclusive, you want to use that else if to handle multiple cases. And remember that these are really useful to be able to use in loops, and I would say using conditionals inside of loops are one of the most common implementations of loops. Why you would use a loop is because you want to affect different numbers or different points in that loop by doing something to them, and to separate out those cases you need to use these conditionals. So I hope that helps, and thank you for watching.